these 10 commandments are these 10 words that God speaks to his bride, in a sense, and says, I vow for these things, and this is who I'm like. And as you break down the 10 commandments, you kind of get to see why they are in the certain order that they are. You have the first 4 pertaining to God, and you have the bottom 6 pertaining to people. And again, think of the whole people of God, not just an individual, but all of these people living in community, living under God as King, and why that's so crucial. What you'll notice even is that all of them are negative statements other than in 4 and 5. And the reason why 4 possibly is, and it's the one, keep the Sabbath, keep it holy. And the 5 is honor your father and your mother. And the promise that comes after. Those 2 seem to be, if you did these 2, you may do the first 3 and the bottom really well. Like having no other gods before me, not creating an idol of or an image, not making God into an image, taking the name of the Lord your God in vain. All, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, all of those other ones. But those 2 are really important. And maybe we don't get it because we don't read it the same.
Right.
But I think there's a clue within the 10 Commandments even.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So you're saying the first 4 commandments are God-oriented.
Yes.
Second 6 are human-oriented.
Yes.
And the kind of the border between those 2, Commandment 4 and Commandment 5, are not only are they the borders, but they're actually written differently.
Yes.
Because all of the other commandments are don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, whereas these 2 are do this.
Yes.
And again, what are the do this? Commandment 4 is
keep the Sabbath.
Keep the Sabbath.
And honor your father.
Honor your father and mother.
Yes.
And there's a sense in which if you did those 2, you would end up fulfilling all of the others.
That's right. Yeah. So if you actually did practice Sabbath, and we talked about what that means, you will only have God as your God. You will not. And the second one's tricky. That's why I think I stumble over it a lot, is it's the idea. So this kind of goes to the golden calf and all that happened even as Moses is up on a mountain, the people of Israel are making this golden calf. And they bowed down to it and all. But the golden calf is an interesting, because the request is, can you build us or represent for us the God that delivered us from Egypt? So, and then that's what Aaron says, here's your God who delivered you out of Egypt. So it's not that it's an idol. It is a representation of God. And that's actually what I think the second commandment is about, is that we don't reduce or represent him visually to what we think he's supposed to be like, but we need to make no images of who he is. And then again, the name of the Lord, it's letting God be who God is. Sometimes my problem is, as Christians, or even myself, is we're not open to the aliveness of God. That God is still living, he's still active, and he's not supposed to be contained in a way. And practicing Sabbath lets God be God, and us being who we are as human beings. There's a certain place for us, but we're not supposed to take God's place.
Right.
And then the fifth one is, again, in ancient cultures, is the primary relationship of all relationships is your family. And how you treat your parents is indicative of maybe how you'll treat everyone else. And think of it a little bit in terms of people who are professional, who now have a living, who are able to help their elderly parents a bit. What do you do with the people who've taken care of you? Do you discard them? Or there's lots of things we could do. Or do you honor them, give weight to who they are, uh, and all of that's encompassed with that. And I always like, and I was taught this in seminary too, is to put those negatives, at least with people, into positives, because really it is the minimal thing that you need to do. Like, I don't know, no one yeah, you haven't committed murder today. Like, these things are very hard to
Right.
do, but what that it kind of helps us is if you put it into a positive, it kind of puts it into a different light. So do not murder becomes everyone has a right to life. Do not commit adultery. Everyone has a right to home. Do not steal. Everyone has a right to possessions. Do not do not bear false witness. Everyone has a right to reputation. Those things, I think, are crucial when you're working in groups and you're trying to be a people.
Fascinating. Can we go back to the golden calf for a second?
Okay.
Because that's a part of the Ten Commandments story.
That's right.
So Moses is on the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, at the bottom of the mountain, they're breaking the commandments in
Yes.
a way, or at least one of them. I thought it was interesting you said that the golden calf that they made was not an idol.
Not
Did you
the
say
way
that?
we think.
No,
Yeah.
so they didn't.
It's not another god.
It's not another god that they're worshiping,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a in their minds anyway, a representation of the god that they do worship.
Yes.
But that's still problematic.
That's right. You can't reduce or... So the hard thing is this. God is pretty, like, even the whole idea of fire and cloud that leads the people. It's interesting, even as they have, it's hard to capture. So there's quite a bit of written on this, but even when someone wants to meet God, they go to a tent, the cloud descends and everything gets dark and no one knows what's going on other than the clouds there, and Moses is speaking with God. So there's this kind of aversion to concretizing or not symbolizing, but making an image of who God is. And I think that's a human tendency, is to do that, like, first. This is God who delivered us. Now, what does he look like? How can we just, like, limit? And then we can always worship that, but we have control over it. And that's exactly what the second commandment is telling you not to do. You have to let God be God, and that he walks among you. Is it in your presence? But you can't contain him. You can't image him. You can't define who he is. And that's exactly what Israel tried to do. It's not that they're worshiping another god. They know this God that delivered them out is worth worshiping. But what they wanted to do is to, make an image of him, like, so we can handle him and he can't handle us.
So a lot of us today think, oh, we don't break that commandment because we're not building, images. But we can do this in other ways.
That's right.
We can do it with ideas about God, and that becomes our idol. We contain God within our particular definition of God.
That's right. Yeah. So that's the danger of the second commandment, is never to let God be God and we are not. And this aliveness to who God is. And I know good theology is great. Things we need to understand, and even studying, it's all good. But once it becomes an instrument, then we're doing exactly what ancient cultures do with idols. The reason why you worship an idol is they're the one who can fulfill a need you have. So if you need, fertile crops, you go to that God to get fertile crops.
Right.
You go to what you need, and God is, at least Yahweh, is not like that in any way. He's willing to be in relationship and to be who he is. And that's probably why he names himself I Am, because he is, and you cannot define him in any kind of way, because then God is, because that's that's the craziness of how God has kind of revealed himself. He's gentle that way. He's not demanding things
Right.
all the time, and in a way, because he's invisible, we can make him up to be almost anything, and it's not what we're supposed to do. And that's why Israel is known as the people of the ear rather than the eye, because it's the ear as you hear, as you listen, as you're guided, rather than the eye that kind of limits, defines. So that's a concept that kind of floats around a bit. But it's again that the golden calf, especially both, in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, it mentions that episode. You can tell what they're doing, and it's, again, and the punishment of that too.
So this goes back again to the same way that we want to use caution about using God's name. We also want to use caution when we're trying to define God or say this is what God is like, this is what God does, these are God's attributes, which we do in theology, but we have to be careful that we're not creating a God in our own image or limiting God.
That's right. And you can see this with the New Testament, right? With Jesus. Everyone misses what God's doing because they all think they know what he's up to. It is a word of caution that we are human in a good and bad way, and we have limitations. And it's hard. I think of, the Lord of the Rings a little bit with Tolkien. It's interesting how always in the best stories, evil is always in your face. Like, that's there. But the underlying God parts is God weaving everything together, and it works out. Like, that's the miracle of it. But it's just how it goes. And when we force God's hand, that's not okay. When we, it's okay, we pray, but we're asking. It's a little different when we are demanding, making an image, saying you have to be like this because this is you. And no one likes to be defined that way.
Right.
I'm not sure God does either.
Right.